American history is filled with countless comedians and writers of piercing wit who have left their mark on our ideas, attitudes, and language. On November 30th, 1835, in the small town of Florida, Missouri, one of the most influential authors of all time was born, Samuel Clemens. Throughout the life of this man, there were many tragedies, such as the loss of loved ones, the burden of racial strain in America, and financial ruin. However, one triumph stood above all others: Mark Twain. 1839. Business opportunities for John Clemens moves the family 40 miles northeast on the banks of the mighty Mississippi to Hannibal, Missouri. 8 years later, in 1847, Samuel's schooling was unfortunately cut short by the death of his father. Then it became crucial to the welfare of the Clemens family that each child take a job. Samuel was apprenticed to a printer named Joseph Ament until his brother Orion bought the Hannibal Journal in 1850. One of the first tragedies in Clemens' life was turned into one of the greatest triumphs of his future: exposure. Exposure to writings, business, and most of all, words. Words that would be his career.
Schooling ended and he was apprenticed to the newspaper. Well, if you think of the one being a tragedy, I think that being apprenticed to the newspaper was one of the best things that could have happened to him in the long run. He was being exposed to all of the local news, all of the regional news, humor. Somebody wrote a funny story in there, he was seeing it. The advertisements that went in there were for everything from the produce coming into the stores to slaves to steamboat comings and goings. And this is what he was exposed to on a daily basis while he was working on the newspapers here in town.
Samuel Clemens continued his journalistic ventures, and in February of 1857, he boarded the steamboat Paul Jones in order to go to New Orleans and then on to South America. This reopened his childhood desire to become a riverboat pilot. Clemens spent a little over 4 years on the river, yet he described it as his schooling, where he became acquainted with all the different types of human nature to be found in fiction, biography, or history. Through Clemens's experiences on the river, he chose and started using the pseudonym Mark Twain. In 1869, Mark Twain's literary triumphs began with The Innocents Abroad. It was a bestseller of that time, which sold over 70,000 copies. 2 years later, Roughing It was published, followed by The Gilded Age a year later. Twain's next book was The Adventures of Tom Sawyer in 1876. Twain used experiences from his own childhood for inspiration. This book was in a language that people could understand. It was the way the common person spoke, the way people acted. It was a story about someone like them.
Twain was one of the first to take the everyday speech of people and put it in a work of art.
The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn was written in 1876 through 1883, the time after the Civil War, when federal troops that had been protecting black people in the South were removed. The Emancipation Proclamation, issued in 1863, and the 13th Amendment in 1865 did end slavery in the United States, yet racism still lingered. Black people still were not being treated properly. Mark Twain's Adventures of Huckleberry Finn was not only a triumph for Mark Twain, but was also a triumph for America. This book exposed the evils of slavery. It exposed the hypocrisy of the good Christian people, and most of all, it exposed black people and gave them a face.
Huckleberry Finn is faced with a great moral dilemma. He can do what he's been taught to do and feel the way he's been taught to feel and turn Jim in as a runaway slave, because of course slaves are property, they don't have feelings. But the time that he spends on the raft with Jim, he finds out that this just isn't true.
This book went beyond racial issues and dealt with the human's personal struggle to do what is the right and moral choice. This book had an impact on society. It dealt with the issues that plagued the minds of so many people in the U.S. in the 1800s. Ernest Hemingway said, "All modern literature comes from one book made by Mark Twain, called Huckleberry Finn. There was nothing before it, and there's been nothing as good as since." Samuel Clemens had a love for money, especially get-rich-quick schemes, and as a result from this, Clemens began to invest in many new products, such as the Mark Twain adhesive scrapbook, which was profitable. He invested in the Page typesetting machine, which cost him over $120,000. His investment in the typesetting machine, the failure of his Charles Webster Publishing Company, and the piling bills for his lavish home ultimately sent Clemens into bankruptcy in 1895. This forced Mark Twain back into the lecture circuit, something he had promised he would never do again. As Samuel Clemens failed, on a personal level, the persona of Mark Twain prevailed with means to pay off his debts. In the summer of 1896, Clemens' lecture tour was drawing to a close in Europe. He had plans to reunite his family in London, but on July 15th, he received a cablegram stating that Susie, his favorite daughter, had gone ill with a fever. Think of it! We can't get an answer to our cablegrams. We began telegraphing at 11 this morning, and now at 11 p.m. we still have no answer, and cannot imagine what the trouble is. On August 18th, 1896, Clemens received a telegraph that Susie was dead. He was convinced that his going into debt and the stress of him being gone had killed her. In 1900, Clemens had all of his debts paid off, but the triumph of money didn't matter to him anymore. He was overwhelmed with the tragedy that seemed always to follow him. His brother Henry had died in a steamboat accident. His son Langdon had died as an infant. And on June 5th, 1904, his beloved wife Livy died. There was yet another cruel heartbreak before Clemens' death. On December 24th, 1909, Jean, his youngest daughter, had gotten up early, determined to make a good Christmas for her father. While she was taking a bath, she had a seizure and drowned. Samuel Clemens' life was immersed in tragedy. As he grew older, his writings began to reflect his attitude towards life. They were bitter and dark, yet in the public eye, Samuel Clemens seemed always to emerge as Mark Twain. Mark Twain scholar Shelley Fisher Fishkin states that Mark Twain taught me things I needed to know. He taught me to understand the raw racism that lay behind the evening news. He taught me that even the most well-meaning people can be hurtful and myopic. He taught me to recognize the supreme irony of a country founded in freedom that continued to deny freedom to so many of its citizens. Clemens is known as the quintessential American author. He was truly the first to capture universals that anyone could relate to. Modern Twain scholars such as Jocelyn Chadwick agree that Twain touches a nerve in America. He is still relevant today. His writings deal with race, religion, and social injustice. We were not, however, completely prepared for Mark Twain and his delicate relationship with Sam Clemens. While Twain, the literary invention, became the most conspicuous person on the planet, Clemens found himself torn between the two worlds and the two identities that he inhabited. Torn between fame and family, between humor and bitterness, bottomless hunger for success, and haunting fears of failure. It became our mission to try to parse the difference between the two personalities. His position was unique in the literature of this world, and his writings form one of the assets of the American contributions to the world's achievements, of which we have the right as a nation to be genuinely proud. On April 21st, 1910, Samuel Clemens died. A tragedy of life lost, however, Mark Twain's triumphs will never fade away.